Good morning and welcome to week 2. This is the first online week of the course. Hopefully your long weekend was restful. I know the Tuesday back is always slightly more difficult than just a regular Monday, so hopefully you're taking your time and getting back to the week. I encourage you as we go about this video to pause if you need to pause and take a break if you need it. I'll talk, for almost a full lecture period, so please take a break as you need to. So this week we're looking at, we're starting Unit 1 and we're looking at it in context. So we're looking at violence at the micro level. So if you remember from last session, we covered a few kind of key points. And the first is that violence is the whole or partial negation of agency through force. Remember, this is our course definition of violence. You also want to remember that force does not always mean physical, while direct contact can be a type of force, so can passive destruction. Another key point is that violence has increased as the West has colonized. So as Western countries have dominated other countries and have colonized them, types of violence have definitely increased. Another key point to remember is that violence is about power. Now, remember that those who have power want to keep it, and those who don't have it want it. So violent means of power maintenance or power acquisition are often viewed as acceptable. If you take a look at the history of the United States, we've gained, and by we I mean people with European ancestry, and European folks have gained control of this country, not by asking nicely, but by violently taking control. Violence creates a dichotomy, and if you remember, we talked about us versus them, and this dichotomy is raced, classed, and gendered in the United States. So what I mean by this is that the us group, or the group with power, is largely white, male, cisgender, and middle or upper class, and the them group, or the group without power, is not those things. Now you may fit into the us and the them group in various different ways, as we talked about last week, and you might fit into an us group in certain contexts and a them group in others. It really depends. But by and large in this country, the us and them groups are pretty well defined. And the last thing to remember from last session is that our perception of violence is context dependent. So we perceive violence as appropriate or inappropriate based on who is committing it and what it is being used for. So if a member of the us group is committing violence, it's justified and it's okay, it's appropriate. And if it's part of the them group that's committing violence, it's not appropriate, it's unjustified, it's criminal, as we would say. So how does that work at the micro level? Well, let's first take a look at what the micro level actually is, because I say all these terms, micro, macro, what have you, without defining them. So let's define them now. So this is Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. Now, this was formulated by Urie Bronfenbrenner. He's an American psychologist, and he formulated the ecological systems theory to explain how the inherent qualities of children and their environments interact to influence how they grow and develop. The Bronfenbrenner theory emphasizes the importance of studying children in multiple environments, also known as ecological systems, which is what each of these circles are, in the attempt to understand their development. According to this systems theory, children typically find themselves enmeshed in various ecosystems, from the most intimate home ecological system to the larger school system, and then to the most expansive system, which includes society and culture. Now, each of these ecological systems inevitably interacts with and influences each other in all aspects of the children's lives. So Bronfenbrenner's model organizes contexts of development into 5 levels of external influence. And so they're categorized from the most intimate level in the center to the broadest on the outside. So as you can see, there are several systems or levels. And let me pull out my little pointer here. So this middle one obviously is the self, and this is the self or the individual. Next is the microsystem here, this kind of darker green level, and the microsystem is the daily home or school or work, peer group and community environment. So this is an individual's immediate environment. The mesosystem, this lighter green here, is the interaction between microsystems and exosystems, which is the next level out. It is in essence a system of microsystems, and so it involves linkages between two microsystems, like a home or a school, between a peer group and a family, and between family and community. For this course, I've simplified it, and I'll explain it further in a minute, and I will also explain it further when we talk about the mesosystem in Unit 2. So don't worry if it seems confusing at this time. The next system out are the exosystem in the dark blue. This looks at institutional systems, so churches, schools, politics. So this pertains to the linkages that may exist between two or more settings. So they may not contain you as an individual, but it'll affect you indirectly. So this might include workplaces of your parents, or workplaces of your friends, or the neighborhood you live in. The focus is not on individual institutions so much as sort of systems of institutions. So the political system, religious system. So not an individual church necessarily, but a system of churches. So Catholicism as a whole rather than one Catholic church, speaking as a former Catholic. The macro system, which is out here, are overarching beliefs and values. And this is the largest and most distant collection of people and places to the south that still has significant influence on you. And so this is comprised of cultural patterns and values, specifically dominant beliefs and ideas, as well as political and economic values. So for example, if you grew up in a war-torn area, you'll experience a different kind of macro system than somebody who grew up in a peaceful environment. So this is your cultural beliefs and values as a whole. And finally, the chronosystem, which is the very outside circle, this sort of blank colored circle here. This adds a useful dimension of time, and this demonstrates the influence of both change and constancy in a person's environment. So the chronosystem might include a change in family structure, if you move, your employment status, as well as immense society changes such as economic cycles and war. So all of the smaller systems, quote unquote, interact with each other over the course of time. For this class, we won't look explicitly at this system, but it's something to consider as we look at historical and current relevant events. And so throughout this course, I'm going to relate current events and historical events to each of the systems that we cover. And it's important to put these events in the context of time. So I won't cover it explicitly, but it is important to know about. So by studying these various ecological systems, this theory is able to demonstrate the diversity of interrelated influences on a person's development. And so it's important to be aware of the context that a person is in, because that can sensitize us to variations in the way we act in different settings. And so it can influence how we go about maintaining or obtaining power and the type of violent acts that we may behave or we may do. So for example, if a child frequently bullies smaller children at school, they may be a terrified victim at home. And so adults who are concerned with that should pay close attention to that child's behavior in different settings, because they may behave differently in one microsystem versus another. And this is influenced by other certain exosystems and macrosystems and chronosystems. So at this point, you might be asking how the heck this relates to violence, and I promise you it does relate. So luckily for you, I have more to talk about on the next slides. So for this course, I've condensed Bronfenbrenner's model into 4 levels, and I apologize for the terrible graphic design. I am very clearly not a graphic designer. But these 4 levels are the self, micro, meso, and macro. So we've condensed them. Hence why the course was broken up into corresponding units. So we've got Unit 1, which is micro, Unit 2, which is meso, and Unit 3, which is macro. I've put self-directed violence or stuff with the self, with micro-level violence, just because it's not, for me, it's not enough to constitute a unit on its own. So I've combined them. This unit looks at microsystems. And so we're looking at one's immediate environment. For this course, microsystemic events occur between individuals. We'll look at the other levels later, so you don't have to worry about them right now. It's important to note that micro-level interactions look at quote-unquote small-scale interactions between individuals, such as conversations and body language. They typically involve personal relationships with family members, with your peers, with your coworkers, and how these groups or individuals interact with you affects how you behave. So similarly, how you react to people in your microsystem will also influence how these people treat you. So nurturing and supportive interactions will foster improved development, and violent interactions will have a negative effect. Going back to what Bronfenbrenner found in this microsystems, because remember he used this to study children, he found that it's possible actually for siblings who find themselves in the same ecological system to experience very different environments. So if two siblings experience the same microsystem, it's not impossible for their development to progress in different manners because each child's personality traits, which are influenced by genetic and biological factors, have a hand in how they're treated by others. So if you remember how we talked about last session, how violence could either be a result of nature or genetics or biology or nurture or environment, Bronfenbrenner kind of thinks that it's both. And so when we look at micro-level interactions, we're looking at not only the nature of the environment in which people are interacting, but also the development of the self as we're looking at these interactions. Now, of course, micro-level interactions are influenced by external context as well, because obviously, they're in this little circle here, but they're also influenced by these circles and by this circle and by chronosystems and exosystems as well. So it's important to know that we can't always classify violent interactions as just micro or macro interactions. They might have elements of both. So for example, you might have an individual killing, one person killing another, which I would consider a micro-level interaction occurring within a genocide. And I consider genocide a macro-level interaction. So for this course, interactions are overly simplified, so you get a sense of what violence looks like at different levels of society. But keep in mind that in quote-unquote the real world, it's much more complicated than that. But we haven't explicitly mentioned how this relates to violence, so let's take a look at that now. So there are more diagrams. This in context video covers a lot of diagrams, and I do apologize. It'll get easier as we go throughout the course. So this is a violence pyramid. I am not the first person to use this pyramid. Academic and policy workers have used similar periods for years. I find that breaking things down into visuals is often helpful. So bookmark this slide for further reference, and we'll return to it throughout the course. So let's take a look at the individual levels of the pyramid before we tie it to this Bronfenbrenner model that I talked about earlier. So the lower level on the bottom here are attitudes and beliefs. And this is the bottom of the pyramid because it is, quote unquote, the least serious and most widespread behavior. Now, while attitudes and beliefs may not always be actual acts of violence, violent acts are almost always supported by a specific set of attitudes and beliefs. So if you believe that a certain group of people should not have rights in this country, that'll influence your behavior towards them, right? So if you think about what we talked about last week, if we think about violent acts towards another individual, what are some attitudes and beliefs that might be a foundation for those specific acts? Take a minute to think about that. The next level up on the pyramid are acts of prejudice or discrimination. So I'm going to combine these two. So now I start moving into actual acts that one can see. We don't usually think of prejudicial or discriminatory acts as necessarily violent, and we'll talk more about what these acts are later in the course. But like attitudes and beliefs, they can occur before quote-unquote typical violent acts. They can also occur at the same time as typical violent acts, which makes things that much more confusing, and I apologize. Then we look at what we think of as typical violent acts, so rape, murder, assault, etc. And maybe some we won't think of as typical, and we'll cover those more later in the course. And finally, at the very top of the pyramid, we look at war and genocide. And this is the top of the pyramid because it is quote unquote the most serious and least common behavior. So if we go, and let me switch my color here, from bottom to top, and I apologize for my terrible arrows, we go from least serious to most serious. Oh, and I apologize for my terrible writing there. And then we also go from most common to least common as we go from bottom to top. Now, it's important to know that a person's behavior may not be categorized as only one part of the pyramid. So something might not just be categorized as attitudes and beliefs or just be categorized as a violent act. The lines between these levels should really be dotted or non-existent. They're solid just so it's easier to see. But it's also important to know that while behaviors at the lower levels of the pyramid, they don't always lead to behaviors at the upper level. So somebody having racist or misogynistic attitudes and beliefs don't always go to commit acts of war or genocide, right? There are some people that, might have racist thoughts or beliefs that never act on them. However, upper level behaviors almost always occur as a result of lower level behaviors that were viewed as okay by society or thought of as appropriate. So nobody necessarily just wakes up one day and says, hey, I'm going to commit genocide. They first go through this series of actions, those attitudes and beliefs, those acts of prejudice, that discrimination, and those otherwise violent acts before it's considered a genocide. So also, nobody's going to wake up and go, hey, I'm going to punch somebody in the face. They've had these thoughts and attitudes beforehand leading up to that violent act. So some behaviors on this pyramid might occur at any level of interaction. So if we're looking at how the two diagrams relate to each other, this pyramid describes specific behaviors. If you go to the previous diagram, that describes levels of interaction at which behaviors may occur. So some behaviors on this pyramid might occur at any level of interaction. So if we think about typically violent acts, we think about murder, we think about assault, whatever. That violent act might be carried out between two individuals, so it might occur at a micro level. Violent acts might occur between two groups, so like gang wars. That's a meso level interaction because we're looking at groups. And then if we look at macro level interactions between systems, we might see violent acts occur between them. So pyramids, behaviors, the Bronfenbrenner, the circle, are levels of society, let's say. So some behaviors on this pyramid are more likely to occur in a specific level of interaction. So genocide, if we look at just genocide as a whole, is not an individual to individual behavior. It's more of a macro level behavior. Microaggressions, on the other hand, which we'll talk about later on in the course, are generally individual to individual behaviors. Now, if this seems confusing, it's okay. We will revisit these diagrams several times throughout the semester. The main thing I want you to take away is that violence does not occur in a vacuum and that there's almost always context. And I encourage you to revisit these slides continuously throughout the course to gain a better understanding of things. So if we look at violence at the micro level, we are looking at violence that occurs at an individual to individual level, or in the case of self-directed violence, between two aspects of the self, we should say. So if we think back to the violence pyramid from the previous slide, violent behaviors at the quote-unquote micro level are often directly related to attitudes and beliefs. So this suggests that micro-level violence is pretty common in society. So if you think about the types of violent behaviors you observe or hear about on a daily to weekly basis, would you agree that micro-level violence is common? Take a minute, think about it. So what we'll cover in this unit, next week we're going to take a look at self-directed violence and microaggressions and what they are and what they look like in society. And the following week, we'll take a look at interpersonal violence, or explicitly violent acts that occur between two individuals. So this video, which I'm not going to play for you right now, but I encourage you to watch on your own time, provides an excellent example of how attitudes and beliefs influence actual acts of violence. So please take the time to watch it fully and look at the speaker notes in the slides to answer the questions below. I will also post this on the YouTube channel in case it doesn't play in this video, and sometimes it doesn't. So I encourage you to check out our YouTube playlist to watch this. It's a fairly long video, so please, take some time to watch it fully. And this is why the lecture part of this video is a little bit shorter, because I want you to watch this TED Talk and answer the questions in my speaker notes. So some takeaways from this video lecture. One is that violence does not occur in a vacuum or out of the blue. There is almost always some sort of context behind which it occurs, and that's what this image is describing on the left here. There are two models you'll want to revisit frequently throughout the course. The first is what I call the modified Bronfenbrenner. So it's very simplified. We're not looking at child development necessarily, but we're looking at levels of society in which behaviors occur. So we're looking at different contexts, and we're going from the smallest levels of society or context to the largest. And we're also looking at the violence pyramid, and so that looks at types of behavior. So again, the violence pyramid looks at types of behavior, and the modified Bronfenbrenner looks at levels of society in which those behaviors occur. So we're going to be looking at these two diagrams in conjunction with each other. So I encourage you to revisit them and ask questions, so that way we can really get a good understanding of them. So if you have any questions, I will still have office hours this week. They're in the syllabus. I will still be available via email. I'm in my office very often, so please feel free to come and visit me or send me an email if you've got questions, especially because this is the first time you're looking at some of these diagrams, and so I know they can be confusing. So please feel free to reach out if you've got any questions. Now, the next session, which will be Thursday, is class activity 1. So that'll be released on Blackboard at 11 o'clock a.m. on Thursday, and you'll have until 11 o'clock a.m. on Friday to complete it. And it'll all be done online, so you don't have to hand anything in to me in person. You'll submit everything via Blackboard. And next week, we will meet in person again, so be prepared to come back next week, and I'll send an email to remind you. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I will release the assignment or class activity 1 on Thursday, and I will see you next week. Thank you for tuning in.